Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, or alternatively, as you will see at the end of this video. In answering these questions online or by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is made useful not only to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now today I'm answering two questions because they had very similar concerns and they came within days of each other, so I thought why not conglomerate them and answer them at the same time. So the first question comes from Kerry P. When was the first archaeological dig? Is there an archaeology of archaeology? I like it. Deep. The second one comes from Araba the Master, who is, that's their username, by the way, hopefully not their real name, and they say, who do you consider the first modern archaeologist? Well, Araba the Master and Kerry P, thank you very much for your questions. I shall now attempt to answer them in some way. So, to answer the first one, when was the first archaeological dig? Is there an archaeology of archaeology? The short answer is yes. There is an archaeology of archaeology, but no, we probably don't know when the first archaeological dig was. Yeah. Now the main reason for this is because it seems just to be a common thread throughout humanity, actually, collecting things from previous times. People have always been interested, or so it seems, in the remains around them, either in the ground or on the floor around them, which tell them about the people who were there before they were there. So, for example, sometimes you'll hear about a Mesolithic tool turning up in a Neolithic context. Occasionally that can be put down to, say, a geological process. Maybe it's ploughing action later on in time, or possibly even rats moving tools through their burrow and thus through time. But occasionally it looks as though people may actually have been collecting their occasional objects. They come across an arrowhead and say, this looks interesting, and take it home with them. And this means that that you can't necessarily positively identify that as being a moment when archaeology began, as it were, but you can certainly infer that people have always been interested in the past. So there is an archaeology of archaeology, and actually there are various recorded instances of archaeological type things occurring. But in terms of the first archaeological dig, well, that's going to be a bit, well, almost impossible to find. So one of the earliest recorded examples of an archaeological type thing happening is in New Kingdom, Egypt, just around about 1500 BC, well, 1200 BC, when the pharaohs decided to excavate, or rather sort of uncover, the Sphinx, who had been covered up to his neck in sand, or her neck, its neck, in sand. Now, the Sphinx is from the Old Kingdom, built for a pharaoh called Khafre, or Khafre. I probably butchered his name. Anyway, and it had become covered. Now there is evidence of this process occurring. Not only tools and things being found where they've sort of cleaned the Sphinx, the sand away from the Sphinx, but also actually where they've actually reconstructed sections of the Sphinx as well. We also have carvings on ivory of the Sphinx up to its neck in sand, so we know it did happen. Then it was uncovered by later Egyptian type folk. So that's a sort of archaeological thing happening. It's not really necessarily an investigation, rather, I suppose, a restoration. And they probably had some sense of what it was that they were looking at. But nonetheless, it's a dig happening of historical stuff. For many people, the first archaeological excavation or investigation happened under the last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, who decided to commission a project to uncover the foundations of a temple. This was around about 500 BC, or just before 500 BC. The temple itself was dedicated to naram-sin, and in that sense, that is an archaeological investigation. They uncovered it, they investigated it, they set out to try and find something, and they did. So that's roughly half the time again from the New Kingdom example in Egypt, so around about 500 BC. But there have been many other examples of that type of behaviour since. For example, many consider the first true archaeological excavation occurred in 1784 with Thomas Jefferson on his estate in Virginia. He came across a burial mound and sliced it in two, got a nice cross-section, and in that sense that could be considered an archaeological investigation, although his motives aren't entirely clear. It could have just been curiosity, which I suppose is a type of archaeology, but it also could have just been sort of landscaping and wanting to chop it through before they knock it down. So, but nonetheless, that's another early-ish example, but again, even closer to us in time. Having said that, all through many known cultures, or many historical cultures, as it were, there have been examples of archaeological type things occurring. The Romans, for example, were great collectors of Greek and ancient Egyptian artifacts and objects in and around the time of Augustus, the humble first citizen and first emperor of Rome. He introduced a whole new fetish is too strong a word, but a whole new focus on Greek sculpture and placed them in and around Rome. So there was definitely that tendency. We know that Cicero was a collector as well. The Song dynasty in China, they collected, or a gentleman collected pieces from times long past. But actually, there were some notable criticisms of that behaviour from other people in society. So even though these gentlemen were collecting these things, they weren't studying them, and others in China didn't think that was a good idea. The Saxons and the Vikings, they used to collect and muse over things from the time before them. In particular, we know that the Saxons wrote poetry about some of the Roman ruins that they came across in Britain, and not least because they were built in stone. They're wondering, who built this? How did they build it? And so we have records of that sort of wonderment, I guess, if that's a word. Also, the Vikings, they used to collect Roman coins and Roman glassware. Notably, actually, the glassware was to take with them to the grave. They were just fascinated by this stuff. So, again, not quite archaeology as we understand it, but nonetheless it is an interest in the past through its material remains. The Aztecs studied their Toltec ancestors, again, by collecting bits and bobs from the landscape around them. I'm going to have to read this one properly. Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, a teacher at Cairo's Al-Azhar University in the 13th century, was one of the first people to actually record in a non-ancient Egyptian context the monuments of ancient Egypt. He was making drawings of these monuments in the 13th century, which have been invaluable for recording and comparing them with how they are today. So you can see probably how they've developed, or rather deteriorated over time. Was there colour in a certain place, or is there a hint that a part of the monument was slightly different just over 700 years ago? So again, there you go. It's another archaeological type thing happening, but that's around about the 13th century. And also, deserving of special mention is William Stukeley in the 18th century, who recorded monuments, Neolithic monuments, such as Stonehenge, in their landscape setting. So those who advocate a phenomenological approach to understanding a monument, i.e. where it is, why it's there, what's around it, William Stukeley, though not necessarily consciously setting out to do it, he was nonetheless making connections between monuments in the landscape in the 1700s. So there you go, yet again an archaeological type thing. So right the way from 1500-ish BC to the 17th century, we have recorded activity of people doing archaeological type stuff in the past. But as in terms of the first ever instance, unfortunately, we're unlikely to ever know when that occurred or what it was. But what we can say is it seems to be a common thread of human behaviour. We've always been intrigued with what's around us and why it's there, and part of that involves studying who put it there. So, thank you very much for the question, Kerry P. To answer the second question, who do you think is the first, or rather, who do you consider to be the first modern archaeologist? Well, Araba the Master, there are many candidates, some from North America, France, South Africa, Scandinavia, and various other places around the world, actually, around about the same time. So we're talking about essentially the 19th century, the 1800s. But for me, the first modern archaeologist, in terms of having an approach which was based upon a research agenda, which was organised, which didn't just go hunting for treasure, and which actually published their findings, has to be General Pitt-Rivers. He excavated in and around his estates in southern England, and obviously he had a military background, being a general. But he brought with him that military focus and the skills of surveying, discipline in the ranks, as it were, and also a methodical approach to an excavation, which really became the diagnostic behaviour of an archaeologist ever since, really. Not least, though, his publication of the Cranbourne Chase monuments, which he excavated between, let me check, 1887 and 1898, remain excellent examples of how to publish, or rather how to think about publishing a monument. You know, obviously they're not, they're not necessarily up to modern standards in that sense, but they're excellent in terms of their approach and the detail that he put into his excavations. And it's a fairly early example of an archaeologist, or an antiquarian, I suppose, becoming an archaeologist. So General Pitt-Rivers is an excellent case in point. Now he obviously passed the baton on to people like Mortimer Wheeler, who also had a military background, but would develop things like the grid square system, this kind of thing. Now those are British examples, and I'm not just choosing them because they're British. Don't make that mistake of thinking that I'm doing that. There are other examples of people taking a very methodical interest in the past, in various other places in the world around about the same time. But I've chosen Pitt-Rivers because I think he personifies many of the key attributes of a modern archaeologist, or many of the key goals, I suppose, and therefore the approach of a modern archaeologist. And as I say, crucially, he wanted to make sure that his findings were published for people to be able to examine and re-examine over time. So if you want, you can go out to a library and find his excavation. Well, specific libraries, but nonetheless libraries, and find the results. So, General Pitt-Rivers, there you go. So that's me. Now I've done my talking. Hopefully these answers have been useful in the context of those questions. Thank you once again for asking the question, Kerry P, or questions, Kerry P and Araba the Master. Wonderful questions, as always, from you guys. There you go. If any of you out there watching this video has an opinion on which archaeologists deserve a mention, please feel free to comment below. And also, actually, if you know of any other early archaeology occurring, I'd be very interested to hear about it. And I'm sure, by the sounds of it, so would Kerry P. So there you go. Thanks, as always, for watching, guys. And until next time, bye-bye.